Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, the blame game. Unpacking the latest U.S. proposal for a ceasefire in Gaza.
It's time to stop all of this haggling and back and forth and start a ceasefire.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken sat down with Al Jazeera for an exclusive interview. So we speak with a former Israeli negotiator for his assessment. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
We could have maybe had a ceasefire 12 days ago, but we don't in this moment because Hamas has not said yes.
That was Antony Blinken speaking to our colleagues in Doha Wednesday. This was his 8th trip to the Middle East since Israel's war on Gaza started. And Blinken was there meeting with leaders to negotiate the latest ceasefire deal. Here's U.S. President Joe Biden explaining the proposal last month.
A full and complete ceasefire, a withdrawal of Israeli forces from all populated areas of Gaza, release of a number of hostages, including women, the elderly, the wounded, in exchange for release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners.
To better understand how this process works or doesn't, we spoke to someone who knows about negotiations.
I am Daniel Levy, president of the U.S. Middle East Project and a former Israeli peace negotiator.
It's good to have you here, Daniel. Thanks for joining The Take. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken just sat down for an exclusive interview with Al Jazeera.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken discussed the war in Gaza and the prospects of a ceasefire deal.
And one of the things that stood out was his statement that the U.S. blames Hamas for the lack of an agreement on a Gaza ceasefire deal.
The proposal that President Biden laid out 12 days ago was virtually identical to one that Hamas had accepted and put forward itself on May the 6th. So there's no reason why this agreement should not be reached.
So he's saying Hamas is the impediment, but Israel hasn't publicly agreed either. So what do you think Blinken is doing here?
I wish I could tell you Blinken was playing a sophisticated game of diplomacy befitting of an American top diplomat Secretary of State, that there were some quiet understandings and the genius of his strategy will only be revealed at a later date. I don't think that's the case. I think that's for the birds. I think Blinken has a very limited mandate. He does not have a president and administration that would back having a standoff with Israel. We know that ever since President Biden gave his speech outlining the plan, the Israeli Prime Minister has categorically said, deal, no deal, phase one, no phase one, we are going to continue with the war until the unrealizable, my editorializing, goals of this war have been achieved. Blinken, therefore, does not have a mandate to use leverage. And so what he is doing is a sleight of hand. He is being deceitful and dishonest and going along with not an attempt to actually get a deal, but an Israeli attempt to divert, make this a blame game, and make it clear that the dead cat will be laid at the door of Hamas. I don't know how this helps American policy goals, the political hopes of this administration in an election season. It certainly doesn't do anything for the people in Gaza who have faced the most horrific of realities.
So I asked for your take on Blinken, and now I'd like your take on Netanyahu and what's happening in Israel. Because as you said, he very publicly committed to continuing the war and has said so frequently.
Israel will not agree to a cessation of hostilities with Hamas after the horrific attacks of October 7th. Calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to terrorism, to surrender to barbarism. That will not happen.
So what is happening in the Israeli government right now? And as someone who's been in rooms like those in these tense discussions, albeit in a very different time, how is it playing out?
I think, Malika, that the degree of tension has significantly subsided. Because to the extent to which the Israelis said, I wonder where the chips are going to fall on this one. Are we actually facing an American administration which is finally going to get over the impasse? And the impasse was an Israeli side that says no ceasefire under any terms, and a Hamas side that says we can only start this if this is a plausible on-ramp to a permanent cessation with maximal reasonable lean in from the US side. So I think there was a moment of, where's this going? I think very quickly they were reassured that the US position had not shifted, that the US was not about to use its leverage to create discomfort on the Israeli side. In the first 24 hours, Netanyahu rather frantically, despite it being the Sabbath, gets on his X account and starts tweeting, well, we'll accept this, but not that. When the Sabbath does go out, on the Saturday, the day after Biden's speech, you have ministers Benjamin and Smotrich saying, well, bring down the government.
The finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, and the national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, have said that they were opposed to striking any deal unless Hamas was wiped out.
But since then, I think there is a degree of calm that has descended on the Israeli political space. The war cabinet ministers who were supportive of the deal, they've also been supportive of the war. Let's not depict them as peaceniks or as human rights and international law defenders. They're far from that. But they were supportive of the deal. They've left the government.
Benny Gantz, one of the most senior members of the Israeli war cabinet, has resigned from the group.
He now has a government that largely understands what this game is largely going along with it. And you know what? No one believes a word this Secretary of State says. No one is threatened by it. No one takes him seriously. This is demeaning. And that means that the atmosphere around Netanyahu is, I don't want to say relaxed, but it's really okay.
Interesting. So I'm trying to take this all in. You mentioned earlier a sleight of hand. Who is this show for then? If it's not necessarily for the Israelis who aren't feeling the tension, as you put it, who is it for?
You know, I wish I had a good answer to that question. You know, it's almost like Blinken thinks we all live in this bubble where we can only hear what the American officials are telling us. So it's not for Hamas, because I don't see how this generates a pressure that they would agree to something where the Israeli side has given its unequivocal answer. As you say, it's not shifting the dynamics inside Israel. I don't think it's convincing the rest of the world. You know what? When the members of the UN Security Council took that vote,
the UN Security Council has endorsed a ceasefire proposal for Gaza put forward by the US President Joe Biden. The resolution urges both Hamas and Israel to implement its terms without delay and without condition.
I don't think this was because they were getting behind an American plan that everyone believed in. I think it was almost cost-free to pass a resolution. And the fact that everyone said, yes, we agree, it showed that it wasn't threatening to anyone because it wasn't achieving anything. And if you followed, at the Security Council, what you have after a vote is that each state gives what it calls an explanation of vote. They have the opportunity to give a speech. And almost all of them did not sound like they were aligned with the US talking points. So who is this for? Does the administration think that they're going to get an A for effort? The other explanation that I think one can at least toy with is when you're inside this bubble of activity and you've got really bad advice and you know your options are really limited, you say to yourself, look, this hasn't got a great chance, but this is all we've got. Let's try. I think it's pitiful, but maybe that's the explanation.
More after the break. So, Daniel, with your experience at the negotiation table during the so-called peace process of the 1990s, What are the signs that you would be looking for of not a blame game, but a real negotiation that could end a war on Gaza that's killed at least 37,000 people and injured 80,000 more?
And there you go. I mean, let's just pause and absorb that, because that is the shocking reality that, diplomats playing games and finding verbal dexterity and rhetorical acrobatics isn't going to bring any of those lives back. And it's not going to stop the continuation of lost lives. It's not going to advance us any nearer to peace. It's not going to bring those Israeli hostages back. I mean, the raid, which caused a horrendous Palestinian casualty toll yet again. So where does it go? I fear that unless we all get a really positive surprise and someone announces that Hamas, maybe as part of their own politicking, and trying to wrongfoot the other side, have said yes, then the onus is on Netanyahu, and somehow he finds a formula where he can start to implement this. Maybe Ben-Gvir and Smotrich backdate or forward date their resignation letters rather, and say, okay, if you don't start the war again after the 6-week first phase, we resign. That would come as a huge surprise to me. I don't think that's where we are. I don't think that's what American diplomacy has leaned into and brought us to. And therefore, I think we are in a blame game. I don't see that there's an incentive. I can't speak to the Hamas considerations, but I don't see why there would be an incentive to any party that were in their position to go further along with something when they know this has already been teed up for them to take the blame. And therefore, that's where we are likely to be. We are likely to be with a continuation of the horrors that we've just been describing and discussing. We may see a further escalation also on the front between Israel, Hezbollah and Lebanon, which will, I think, not be amenable to a ceasefire either, unless you get a ceasefire in Gaza. So I fear that's where we're stuck.
Daniel, the U.S. blames Hamas for the lack of an agreement on this Gaza ceasefire deal, as we've said. And you talked earlier about the U.S. not using leverage. So break it down for us. What leverage should the U.S. be using?
So first of all, I think the Biden administration has demonstrated a spectacularly poor reading of Israeli politics. They keep thinking that a bit of rhetoric or dangling the carrot of Saudi normalization. Israel got normalization with other states while continuing with the most egregious aggressive policies against the Palestinians. So Netanyahu can turn around and the Israeli public will believe him because they've experienced it and say, well, that's a very nice deal, but we can get it without these things that I don't like. So they keep either getting bad advice or, again, because they come with such a weak hand, taking this approach. In that Blinken interview, and in his statements in the region especially, what we heard the Secretary of State say is that the US, and these are the words he used, is making the largest contribution of any nation on earth, he told us, to aid to the Palestinians, and they pledged some $400 million.
And we've now, since the start of the war in Gaza, contributed nearly $700 million and $2.2 billion during the course of this administration.
What he didn't mention is that they are the largest contributor on earth of weapons to Israel. None of this could have continued and been possible without that conveyor belt of weaponry, despite what we've heard coming out of the ICJ, despite what we've seen as a request for arrest warrants from the chief prosecutor at the ICC, despite everything we see with our own eyes. So you know what? Keep your aid, but stop sending your weapons. Because the weapons do so much more harm than the aid can possibly ever make good on. And that, my answer to your question, Malika, is if the US put that on the table, said under these circumstances, by the way, just to be compliant with US law, let alone international law, these are the weapons that we are going to stop sending. These are the conditions for receiving our weapons. Then Israel has to recalculate. I'm not saying it happens overnight, and that's the point. They would have to maintain this standoff. Then the Israeli military turns around and says, Mr. Prime Minister, we have this need to be prepared on our northern front. This is what we would require on our southern front. You have no end date to this operation. We can't continue. You have to prioritize. That, I think, could generate a different conversation inside Israel. The US has chosen not to do that. And let's also be frank, the US has taken a painfully callous attitude towards this because we never hear, not in Blinken's recent interviews and not in his statements or other officials' statements throughout, we never hear them telling us, how come so many Palestinians have been killed? Who's dropping the bombs? Who's doing that? It's always the passive voice. And it's actually gut-wrenching, but it's also deeply irresponsible and indefensible.
So, Daniel, you were, as we've mentioned, a former negotiator for Israel in the 1990s under Prime Ministers Yitzhak Rabin and Ehud Barak. Putting yourself back in your shoes then, could you have imagined that you would be here today talking about this?
Gosh. No, I don't think my imagination was capable of that, and probably that's probably a good thing. But I just wish we'd never lived through this. We saw at that time, it was a strange moment in the world. There was this kind of unipolar moment, and we saw a really dramatic breakthrough on the South African front for all the inequality and structural factors that country still has to address. We saw apartheid end. We saw Mandela walk free. We saw a peace process in Northern Ireland, which hasn't resolved everything, but here we are in a totally different reality. But in this instance, we saw the US indulge the party that was supposed to be on the path to ending its occupation. That occupation has become more entrenched. The structural violence has intensified. In fact, the legal designation now made by not only Palestinian and Israeli human rights NGOs, not only Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, but by many states, is that this now meets the bar of a legal definition of apartheid. So in that intervening period, that's where we've gone, and yet here we are, still without that action being taken that's needed. And let's also end this by acknowledging that's not just up to the United States. Not only the United States has trade and sends weapons and has leverage. And so maybe if we zoom out, the actions that we've seen on the streets, I think, are driving the beginnings of a new set of possibilities for changing the cost-benefit calculation for Israel. I want Israelis to know the peace of not being an oppressor. And I want Palestinians to get out from this reality of not only the horrors of Gaza, but of being denied their rights. So if that is intensified, and if states step up, not just the US, maybe we turn this around. I believe we can do that.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Amy Walters and Sarí el-Khalili, with Ashish Malhotra and me, Malika Bilal. It was edited by Noor Wazwaz. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.